The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. Dean Martin hadn't spoken to Jerry Lewis in 20 years, but the voice on the other end was dying, and the words he whispered would haunt Dean until his final breath. December 15, 2016. The Beverly Hills mansion sat in perfect silence, surrounded by the kind of darkness that only money could buy. High hedges, private gates, and enough distance from the street to ensure that Dean Martin's golden years would be lived in the solitude he had come to crave. At 79, Dean had become a ghost haunting his own life, emerging only for doctor's appointments and the occasional dinner at his favorite Italian restaurant, where they still set an extra place at his table out of habit and heartbreak. The house was too big for one man, filled with the echoes of laughter that had died with his son Dino, and dreams that had been buried with every friend who had left before him. Frank Sinatra's chair in the living room remained untouched, a shrine to brotherhood that no longer existed. Sammy Davis Jr.'s photograph smiled from the mantelpiece, frozen in time when the world was young and full of possibilities. Dean Martin was sound asleep in his king-sized bed when the shrill ring of his bedside telephone cut through the December silence like a blade through silk. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the area code was familiar: Las Vegas, the city that had made him a legend and broken his heart in equal measure. Dean's first instinct was to let it ring. At 3:47 in the morning, good news never came through a phone line. In his experience, late-night calls brought only news of death, scandal, or regret. But something made him answer. Maybe it was the persistence of the caller. They had hung up and called back 3 times in the span of 5 minutes. Maybe it was the fact that Frank was gone, Sammy was gone, Joey Bishop was gone, and the list of people who had his private number was getting shorter every year, like a guest list for a party that nobody wanted to attend anymore. Or maybe it was something deeper, a sixth sense honed by 7 decades of reading people and situations that told him this call would change everything. Dean picked up the phone with the same reluctance he had once reserved for meetings with studio executives and divorce lawyers. His voice was gravelly with sleep and decades of cigarettes, roughened by the kind of living that had defined his generation. Yeah? The voice on the other end was weak, barely more than a whisper, but Dean recognized it immediately. It was a voice that had made him millions of dollars and cost him even more in heartache. A voice that had shared countless stages, countless jokes, countless dreams back when they were young and believed they were untouchable. A voice he hadn't heard in 20 years, but that he would know in his grave, the way you never forget the sound of your first love or your deepest wound. Dean, it's me. It's Jerry. The name hit him like a physical blow. Dean Martin sat bolt upright in bed, his heart starting to pound against his ribs like a caged bird trying to escape. The Egyptian cotton sheets that had once seemed so comfortable suddenly felt like restraints. Jerry Lewis, his former partner, his former best friend, his former brother, the man he had loved and hated in equal measure for 4 decades, whose absence had shaped Dean's life as much as his presence once had. The memories came flooding back, uninvited and unwelcome. The Paramount Theater in New York, 1946. 2 kids from nowhere. Dean from Steubenville, Ohio. Jerry from Newark, New Jersey, meeting for the first time and discovering a chemistry that would make them the biggest act in show business. The late nights in dingy clubs, splitting a room and sharing dreams. The breakthrough at the Copacabana. The movies, the money, the magazine covers. And then the end. Bitter and sudden and devastating, like a car crash in slow motion. Jerry, Dean said, his voice barely steady, each syllable carefully measured to hide the earthquake happening inside his chest. What do you want? It was a cruel question, loaded with 20 years of silence and resentment. But Dean Martin had learned long ago that cruelty was sometimes the only armor available when your heart was too broken to fight fair. There was a long pause. Dean could hear Jerry breathing, labored and painful. He sounded old. He sounded sick. He sounded like a man who was running out of time. I'm dying, Dean. Those 3 words hit Dean like a physical blow. He had heard rumors about Jerry's health, muscular dystrophy, heart problems, the inevitable toll of 90 years on this planet. But hearing it from Jerry's own mouth made it real in a way that gossip never could. I'm sorry, Dean said, and he meant it. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the lawsuits and the bitter words and the decades of silence, Dean Martin had never stopped caring about Jerry Lewis. How long? 6 months, Jerry said. Maybe less. The doctors, they don't really know. Dean closed his eyes. He was 79 years old himself, and he knew how this story ended. They were all leaving now, one by one, the last remnants of a golden age that the world would never see again. Why are you calling me, Jerry? After all this time? Another pause. Longer this time. Dean could hear something in the background, maybe a medical machine, maybe just the sound of an old man struggling to breathe. Because I need to tell you something, Jerry said finally. Something I should have told you 40 years ago. Something that's been eating me alive. Dean Martin had built his entire life on being cool, on never letting anything rattle him, but his hand was shaking as he held the phone. He had a terrible feeling that whatever Jerry was about to say would shatter the last illusion he had about their partnership. "I'm listening," Dean said. Jerry took a shaky breath. "Dean, I need you to know that breaking up the act, it wasn't my idea." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished cigarette. Dean felt the room spinning around him. For 20 years, he had believed that Jerry Lewis had destroyed their partnership out of ego, out of a desire to be a serious actor, out of some misguided belief that he was bigger than the team. "What are you talking about?" Dean asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Jerry took a shaky breath, and Dean could hear something rattling in his chest, like old leaves in a dying tree. "Dean, I need you to know that breaking up the act, it wasn't my idea. It was never my idea. It was never my idea." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished cigarette. Dean felt the room spinning around him, the expensive artwork on the walls blurring together. For 20 years, he had believed that Jerry Lewis had destroyed their partnership out of ego, out of a desperate desire to be taken seriously as a dramatic actor, out of some misguided belief that he was bigger than the team that had made him famous. Dean had convinced himself that Jerry saw him as deadweight, a relic from a simpler time when comedy teams ruled the world. The truth was always more complicated than the story, but sometimes the story was all you had. "What are you talking about?" Dean asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. There was a terrible certainty in Jerry's voice, the sound of a man finally ready to excavate a grave he had been avoiding for decades. "It was Paramount," Jerry said, his voice getting stronger now that the confession had begun, like a man who had been holding his breath underwater and was finally surfacing. "They came to me in early 1956, right after artists and models broke box office records. Hal Wallace himself called the meeting. You remember Hal? He discovered us, made us stars. He was like a father to us." Dean remembered Hal Wallace, a giant of a man who wore power like a perfectly tailored suit and had the ability to make or break careers with a phone call. Wallace had been their champion at Paramount, the executive who saw the potential in two young comedians when everyone else in Hollywood thought they were just another novelty act. Hal brought me into his office, that massive corner office with the view of the Hollywood Hills. He had champagne waiting, Cuban cigars. He made a toast to our success, told me I was the funniest man since Charlie Chaplin. Then he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. "What offer?" Dean asked, but his voice sounded distant, like it was coming from someone else's throat. 20 pictures, Jerry said, a solo contract, complete creative control, top billing, and $10 million more money than we had made together in our entire 10-year partnership. Dean's blood turned to ice water in his veins. "What condition?" "They wanted me to leave you behind." The silence that followed was deafening. Dean Martin stared at the ceiling of his bedroom, trying to process what he was hearing. For 60 years, he had believed that Jerry Lewis had abandoned him for fame and fortune. The truth was somehow worse. Jerry had been forced to choose between their friendship and his career, and he had chosen his career. "They said you were holding me back," Jerry continued, his voice breaking. "They said I was the real talent, the real star. They said I could be the next Charlie Chaplin, but only if I went solo. They gave me 24 hours to decide." Dean felt tears forming in his eyes, but he wasn't sure if they were tears of sadness or rage or something more complex. The grief that comes from realizing that the story you've been telling yourself about your life has been wrong all along. "So you chose the money." "I chose the money," Jerry admitted. And Dean could hear him crying now, the sound of a 90-year-old man finally allowing himself to feel the weight of the worst decision he had ever made. "God help me, Dean. I chose the money. I was 30 years old, and they were offering me the world. I convinced myself that you would be fine, that you would find success on your own. I convinced myself that it was just business. But I knew, even then, that I was lying to myself." "Just business," Dean repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth, like medicine that couldn't cure what was really wrong. "But it wasn't just business," Jerry continued, his voice breaking like a dam that had been holding back a lifetime of regret. "It was the worst decision I ever made. Not because of the money or the fame. I got all of that, just like they promised. I became a star, directed my own movies, got my name on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But Dean, I lost my best friend. I lost my brother. I lost the only person in Hollywood who ever really understood me, who knew me before the fame and loved me anyway." Dean Martin was crying now, silent tears rolling down his cheeks like rain on a window. He was thinking about all the years they had lost, all the jokes they never shared, all the moments that could have been different if Jerry had just been honest with him from the beginning. 20 years of silence, 20 years of anger, 20 years of missing the one person who had made him laugh until his sides hurt. The cruelest part was that Dean had known, on some level, that something was wrong. In those final months before the breakup, Jerry had been distant, distracted. He would stare off into space during their performances, as if he were already somewhere else. Dean had attributed it to creative differences, to Jerry's growing interest in directing, to the natural evolution of their partnership. He had never imagined that Jerry was wrestling with an impossible choice, that every day they worked together was a day Jerry was lying to his best friend. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dean asked, the question that had been burning inside him for 20 years finally finding its voice. "Why did you let me think you just left? Why did you let me believe that I wasn't good enough?" "Because I was ashamed," Jerry said, and the admission hung between them like a confession in a church where no one believed in forgiveness anymore. "Because I knew that if I told you the truth, you would have tried to talk me out of it, and the terrible thing is you probably could have. You always could talk me out of anything, Dean. You were the only person who could make me see reason when I was being an idiot. I was afraid that if I looked into your eyes and told you what they were offering me, I would have walked away from it all. And I didn't want to be that strong. I wanted the money more than I wanted to be a good friend." The confession hung between them like a bridge made of regret. Dean could see it all now. The meetings with studio executives, the pressure, the impossible choice between loyalty and ambition. Jerry Lewis, the man the world saw as confident and commanding, had been just a scared kid offered more money than he could imagine. "So you made me the villain," Dean said. "I made you the villain," Jerry agreed. "I let you think I was leaving because I thought I was better than you. I let you think I didn't need you anymore. It was easier than admitting I was weak." Dean Martin had spent 20 years being angry at Jerry Lewis for breaking up their act. Now he realized he should have been angry at him for something far worse, for being a coward. "The night of our last show," Jerry continued, "when we walked off stage for the final time, I wanted to tell you. I came to your dressing room, remember? I stood outside your door for 10 minutes, trying to find the courage to knock, but I could hear you inside, talking to Jean, making plans for your solo career. You sounded so excited about the future. I couldn't bring myself to ruin that with the truth." Dean did remember that night, July 25, 1956, at the Copa in New York. The end of an era. He had been talking to his wife about his plans to become a serious actor, about his dreams of being more than just the straight man in a comedy team. He had been optimistic about the future, confident that he could succeed on his own. "I spent the next 60 years wondering if I made the right choice," Jerry said. "I made my movies. I got my acclaim. I became a star, just like they promised. But Dean, I was never as funny without you. I was never as happy. Every joke I told, every scene I performed, I found myself looking to the side, waiting for your reaction, but you weren't there." The tears were flowing freely now. Dean Martin, the king of cool, was sobbing in his bed at 4 a.m., grieving for a friendship that had been murdered 60 years ago by greed and fear. "Jerry," Dean said, "why are you telling me this now? Why tonight?" "Because I'm dying," Jerry said simply, "and I couldn't take this secret to the grave. I needed you to know that leaving you wasn't about ego or ambition or thinking I was better than our act. It was about being young and stupid and scared. It was about making the worst decision of my life, and then being too proud to admit it." Dean wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The anger that had sustained him for 2 decades was melting away, replaced by something more complex, sadness for what they had lost, but also a strange sense of relief. The Jerry Lewis who had abandoned him wasn't the real Jerry Lewis. The real Jerry Lewis had been trapped by circumstances and his own weakness, just like any other human being. "I forgive you," Dean said, and he meant it. Jerry Lewis began to cry on the other end of the line. They were the tears of a man who had been carrying a burden for 60 years and was finally setting it down. "Thank you," Jerry whispered. "Thank you, Dean." They talked for another 40 minutes. They talked about the old days, about the crowds, and the laughter and the feeling of being young and invincible. They talked about their families, their regrets, their hopes for whatever came next. For those 40 minutes, it was 1955 again, and Martin and Lewis were the biggest act in show business. When they finally hung up, Dean Martin sat in his bed as the sun began to rise over Beverly Hills. He felt lighter somehow, as if a weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. But he also felt profoundly sad. They had lost so much time. There had been so many years when they could have been friends again, so many opportunities for reconciliation that they had let slip away out of pride and stubbornness. 6 months later, on August 20th, 2017, Jerry Lewis died at his home in Las Vegas, surrounded by his family and the memories of a career that had spanned 7 decades. The news broke on a Sunday morning, interrupting regular television programming with the kind of somber announcement that marked the end of an era. The world mourned the loss of a comedy legend, but Dean Martin mourned the loss of something more precious, the man who had known him when he was just Dino Crocetti from Steubenville, before the fame and the fortune and the heartbreak that came with both. Dean Martin flew to Las Vegas for the funeral, something he had sworn he would never do. He hadn't set foot in that city since Sammy's death, couldn't bear the memories of all the nights they had owned those stages, all the dreams they had shared in the desert. But this was different. This was closure, or as close to closure as a man in his 80s could hope to find. He sat in the back row of the chapel, wearing dark sunglasses to hide his tears and a black suit that hung loose on his diminished frame. The years had not been kind to Dean Martin. Emphysema had stolen his breath, grief had stolen his appetite, and loneliness had stolen his will to fight. He looked like what he was, a man who had been waiting to die for a very long time. The service was everything Jerry would have wanted. Grand, theatrical, filled with celebrity testimonials and standing ovations. But Dean barely heard any of it. He was lost in his own memories, thinking about the phone call that had changed everything, about the forgiveness that had come too late to save them both. When they asked if anyone wanted to say a few words, Dean stood up slowly, his arthritic joints protesting every movement. The chapel fell silent. Nobody had expected to see Dean Martin at Jerry Lewis's funeral, let alone hear him speak. "Jerry Lewis was my partner for 10 years, Dean said, his voice strong and clear despite the years of damage. He was also my friend. People think we hated each other, but that's not true. We just forgot how to talk to each other. Jerry was one of the funniest men who ever lived, and I was honored to share the stage with him. I just wish we had remembered that sooner." He paused, looking down at the casket where his former partner lay in eternal silence. 6 months ago, Jerry called me in the middle of the night. He told me things I needed to hear, things that had been eating at him for 60 years. We talked for 47 minutes, and for those 47 minutes it was 1955 again, and we were young and stupid, and thought we would live forever. I want you all to know that Jerry Lewis was a good man who made one bad choice and spent the rest of his life paying for it. He deserves to be remembered for his laughter, not his regrets. After the funeral, Dean Martin drove through the Nevada desert, taking the long way back to Los Angeles. He stopped at a roadside diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s, ordered black coffee and apple pie, and sat by a window watching the sun set over the mountains. For the first time in years, he felt something approaching peace, but peace, Dean had learned, was just another word for being too tired to fight anymore. Dean Martin died 3 months later, on November 19, 2017, in the same Beverly Hills mansion where he had answered Jerry's final call. The doctors said it was his heart, acute respiratory failure complicated by the emphysema that had been slowly killing him for years. But those who knew him understood the truth. The call from Jerry had healed an old wound, but it had also opened a new one. Dean had spent 60 years being angry at Jerry Lewis, and anger was fuel, something that kept you moving even when you didn't want to get out of bed. Now he had to spend his final months being sad for him instead, and sadness, Dean had learned, was a much heavier burden than anger. At Dean's funeral, the chapel was packed with the last remnants of Hollywood's golden age. Frank Sinatra Jr. was there, looking like a ghost of his father. Shirley MacLaine wept openly in the front row. Nancy Sinatra sang "That's Life" in a voice that broke on every note, but it was Frank Sinatra Jr. who delivered the most important moment of the service when he read a letter that Dean had written to be delivered after his death. The letter was addressed to Jerry Lewis's family, and in it, Dean explained that their phone call had been one of the most important conversations of his life. He forgave Jerry completely, he wrote, not just for the decision to break up the act, but for the 20 years of silence that followed. He understood now that they had both been victims of an industry that chewed up friendships and spat out careers, that demanded choices no human being should ever have to make. Jerry and I were kids from nowhere who got everything we ever dreamed of, Dean had written. The tragedy is that we forgot that the best thing we had was each other. We let pride and hurt feelings steal 20 years that we could have spent as friends. I don't want anyone else to make that mistake. Life is too short to stay angry, too precious to waste on regret. Call your friends, tell them you love them. Don't wait for the phone to ring at 3:47 a.m., because by then it might be too late. The letter ended with a simple sentence that summarized everything Dean Martin had learned in his 79 years. The only thing worse than losing a friend is wasting the time you have with them. In the weeks that followed, entertainment journalists tried to piece together the story of Dean and Jerry's final conversation, but the details remained private, protected by family members who understood that some secrets were too sacred to share. What mattered wasn't the specifics of what they said to each other, but the fact that they had found their way back to each other before it was too late. Martin and Lewis had been the greatest comedy team in the history of entertainment, a partnership that had generated billions of laughs and influenced countless performers who came after them. But their real legacy wasn't the movies or the records or the millions of dollars they had earned. Their real legacy was a reminder that friendship is fragile, that pride is dangerous, and that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is pick up the phone and tell someone you're sorry. The phone call that began at 3:47 a.m. on December 15, 2016, had lasted 47 minutes. But the conversation it started about forgiveness, about regret, about the price of silence, would echo long after both men were gone. In the end, Martin and Lewis had given the world one final performance, a masterclass in how to say goodbye, how to forgive the unforgivable, and how to find grace in the darkness that waits for all of us. Years later, when film historians and comedy scholars write about Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, they will focus on the 10 years they spent together on stage and screen. But the people who loved them will remember the 47 minutes they spent together on the phone, two old men in the darkness, finally telling each other the truth.